I'm Marilyn Mayo. I grew up in Brooklyn in New York, and my family is from, three of my grandparents are from the same village. They're from Castoria, and one grandfather's from Monastir, and my mother's family and my father's family knew each other for hundreds of years, just hundreds of years. And my parents grew up together, and they were part of a community in Brooklyn called the New Lots community. And growing up was wonderful, being around that community, because it was so rich in culture, and we were told that, you know, as someone said earlier in the, I mean, that the Sephardic Jews were, like, you know, the great part of this, like, great community that was, you know, aristocrats, and we grew up kind of poor to middle, you know, poor working class, but we still had that sense of having come from this amazing culture. And my parents grew up, Ladino was their first language, and they didn't really speak it at home unless they didn't want us to know what they were talking about. But the foods and the you know, the expressions that we grew up with. My aunt used to say "Nevada que no te vea," which is, "We should never see you nervous," which is something that they used to say all the time. You know, we had, like, just amazing foods. My aunt used to come. She was like my grandmother because she was 20 years older than my mom, and she would come to the house and she would make, you know, burekas and biyikus, and she would make noodles, fresh noodles, and dry them on sheets all over the beds, and taralikus, and you know, Passover was amazing. The foods that we ate were incredible. But I always had this sense as a kid that this culture was just so vibrant and something that needed to be, you know, preserved in some way, because even growing up, I could see that it was kind of moving away from us. You know, it was, you know, my brothers and I didn't speak the language really. We were, but it was, but in the, you know, even in, like, when we were growing up, when we had bar mitzvahs or weddings, everything that we did, the dancing was all Greek. You know, people would, the culture was very much a part of that time. You know, my parents' generation still carried it with them, but after that generation, it kind of died down. I mean, most people didn't marry, you know, other Sephardic folks, and yeah, it was, I think, you know, for me, I tried to learn the language. I took classes with David Altuve, I think you heard his name today, and you know, learned to read Ladino in the original Hebrew, and went to Castoria, where my family's from, and found people who remembered my family, and went back in 1998 with survivors who survived the Holocaust, and there was a commemoration. So for me, the culture is something that I want to preserve in my life, and to, as someone said, when I said preserve, they were like, "What do you mean preserve? We got to keep it going, not just preserve it." And I think that's true. But it's just like even the expressions, you know, I'm trying to think of, like, my mother taught me a song that, you know, that I still think of in my mind, and I can't sing, so I don't know about singing it. But una hora la ventana, otra hora nel balcón, que le sepa la mi madre que yo quiero hacer amor. And then the one sings, ya lo sepa la mi hija, ya lo sepa con razón, los hijos de ahora te dejan con el pasión. So it's a love song, you know, about a woman sitting by the window waiting for love, and her mother's discourages her. She says the young men of today just leave you with passion and nothing else. So my father's parents are from Castoria. My mother's parents married in Europe. My grandfather was from Monastir, and Castoria was a very small city in Greece, so they used to marry Jews from this city, Monastir, which was not too far away because it was such a small community. And they came around 1920, and they came to the Lower East Side and lived, I think my father's family lived on Orchard Street, and my mother's family lived on, I believe it was Eldridge. So I could be wrong about that. But so they stayed there for a while, and lived in the tenements of the Lower East Side, and then a lot of people started moving to Brooklyn. My mother moved to Williamsburg, but my father moved to New Latz, and then my mother's family moved to New Latz, and New Latz became a pretty big Sephardic community. They had, I came a little bit, I mean, I was born like after the community had already started dissipating, but the community was, like from what I hear from my cousins, my older cousins, every other house was a relative. Every other house was a cousin, an aunt, an uncle. They started a group called the United Sephardim of Brooklyn to try to pass the culture on to their children, and they had all the holidays that they celebrated, and Purim is a very big holiday in the Sephardic community, and that was celebrated a lot. And then it's the foods that really carried on the culture. So I think my grandparents, they came, they worked, I believe, in the garment business. My grandfather was definitely in the garment business. It was famous for fur, but the Jews were not so involved in the fur trade there, not so much. But my grandfather was not in the fur business, but he came here and, as a young man, and then did have some kind of business in terms of clothing. My mother's father died in the 20s, so I don't know what he did, but my mother tells me that she was, everyone talks about my grandmother, how amazing she was. I'm named for her. She used to she was a real fighter and protector of her the family, and she sent my uncles away from New York when they got involved with the wrong crowd, and but she would bake on Fridays in the morning. She would bake tons and tons of food and buyikus and borekas and all this stuff, and just give it out to everybody in the neighborhood. And she was just known for that. And her name was Merka, which is that's a Sephardic tradition. When a baby is born and there's a death surrounding the birth, they sell the baby to make sure that they are not followed by this bad luck. And then they're called from then on Merkata for a girl or Mercado for a boy. And so they called her Merka for short. So when I was growing up, I was called Merka because I'm named for my grandmother, sometimes by older people in the generation who knew her and knew her name. That always was a connection for me too, to the culture that I had her name. It's to keep from the evil eye, the Ojumalu,